China now accounts for nearly 50% of the U.S. goods trade deficit. If this was just the natural product of free market forces, we could understand it, but it's not.
Quite the opening line from Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, who this morning came out swinging as he welcomed China's Vice Premier Wang Yang to Washington, D.C. Team Ross Manoogian, the Treasury Secretary, on the offense when it came to the U.S. and China's trade gap. This as both the U.S. and China then canceled the news conference that was scheduled for 5 p.m. this evening. Today's U.S.-China economic dialogue comes together following China President Xi Jinping's visit to Mar-a-Lago back in April, where the president sort of set the stage for what's happening today. What are the most critical points the two countries need to focus on to make it a fairer trade relationship, because there is a huge trade deficit with China that they benefit from? We've got former Assistant Secretary of State and former Goldman Sachs Vice Chair Bob Hormats. I'm sure that the Chinese were like, check, please. That's why we had the banner, check, please, because it was a tense moment, certainly. But some people are saying that Secretary Ross did just the right thing in a calm and measured way. He stated the big problem right off the bat without any tap dancing, and that is that there is a very lopsided trade relationship between the U.S. and China that favors China heavily.
Well, certainly there's a big trade imbalance, as we've seen. China has a big trade surplus with the United States. The question is what the reasons for that are. And the major reason is that China is a very competitive country. That's, I think, a fundamental point we have to bear in mind. Are there certain things that the Chinese do to give them added advantage? Do they provide support for state enterprises? Yes, they do. So there are certain components of the relationship that we have to work on. And I think that's what Secretary Ross is trying to get at.
Let me push you here, Bob, because right now we have a trade deficit. That means we're on the bad end of this with China of $309 billion. And with us, they've got a $22 billion surplus from the most recent numbers. Fine, then we'll get just as competitive as the Chinese.
Well, the thing we have to bear in mind is the Chinese have a big surplus, in part because a lot of other Asian goods that were produced elsewhere in Asia have moved into China because China is a competitive supplier. China is also, however, and I think we ought to bear this in mind, their manufacturing sector has over a period of time been losing people too. They have been moving, companies have been moving particularly low-priced products, have been shifting away from China to Vietnam, Bangladesh.
Okay, I'm not crying for the Chinese.
No, I'm simply saying that there's a process of shift going on here. Are there things we have to work on? Yes, indeed.
Okay, which
Intellectual property protection is a big issue. When I was there, other undersecretaries of state who've been in my job have...
Well, that's like pirating, okay. But what about accepting more of our goods, taking the tariffs and the barriers that are sometimes hidden off of U.S.-made goods?
Well, there are. I think there are certain things the Chinese need to do to open up. We've been working and pressing the Chinese to open up in numerous areas, particularly for American high-technology companies. But a lot of American companies are still doing very well in China. If you take individual companies, the big problem is not so much that they encounter huge barriers in China to trade. The barriers are on the investment side, but no, not so much on the trade side. But the worry is that over a period of time, China's reserved 7 areas of strategic importance for them, and I think they're going to be becoming more competitive in those areas and maybe resisting American sales.
Well, on the screen are the top exporters. So, folks, if you own Apple or Boeing or NVIDIA, which makes graphic chips for all kinds of equipment, then is this a positive for them that Wilbur Ross is putting up fisticuffs here?
Well, it depends how it's done. The American companies do not want a trade war with China. They want the United States to take an assertive position. But they have a big market in China. For many of these companies that you've identified and many more, the China market's growing.
Well,
so this is a mixed picture. It's not all a negative picture. The big element is that China is very competitive, not just in low-wage products anymore. They used to be, but those have shifted. They're moving up the technology line.
Let me bring up, before we go, because we're running out of time, John Huntsman, who was President Obama's ambassador to China. Now, last night, President Trump floated him as his pick for Russia, ambassador to Russia. You know John Huntsman.
Very well.
Would he be a good person in this
He'd
role?
be excellent. He was ambassador to Singapore before. He was ambassador to China, as
Right.
you correctly pointed out. He speaks fluent Chinese. He doesn't know that much about Russia, certainly not as much as he knows about China, but he is a smart guy. He'll be very assertive. The real question is, do the Russians think that the president is going to listen to him? The president has a lot of people around him. Is he going to listen to John Huntsman? I hope he does, because John's a rational guy. John will understand the relationship. John will push hard for America's interests, but he'll also try to explain to Trump how to deal with the Russians on the basis of his knowledge and his presence in Moscow.
And I will say John Huntsman was an early friend of Fox Business. When other business networks were threatening CEOs and leaders and governors, he tuned them out and came right here in our first, second, third, on, with the lean years, where now, of course, we're beating them by...
He's an independent thinker and a good guy. He's one of, if we could have more ambassadors around the world like John Huntsman, and the president needs to start naming ambassadors, naming people in the State Department to get a really effective foreign policy, and John will be part of that.
Thank you so much. Bob
Pleasure.
Hormats.